Today we're going to take our first steps into building sentences with Nafi. That's probably what you all came here to do. So we're going to begin with a very important concept of word order. Now before I explain how Nafi handles word order, let's take a moment to think about English word order. Why do you think it is that we put words in the order that we do? Why am I saying the words I am saying in the order that I am? Ultimately it boils down to this. English leans heavily into word order to communicate information. You might not think about this on the reg, but whenever you're listening to a sentence or speaking a sentence, you're actually providing subtle pieces of information independent of the words you are using, and you are doing this through word order. Let's consider the sentence, Jake sees Neytiri. Instantly you can imagine this picture. You can tell immediately who's doing what. But how is that? The answer is, in English, we expect information in this very precise order of subject, verb, object. A subject is the one performing the verb. It's the doer of the verb, if you will. We obviously know what the verb is. In this case, it's see. It's the action. And then you have the direct object, sometimes just called the object, but there are other kinds of objects. The direct object is the thing affected by the verb, the thing the verb is done to. So when I say, Jake sees Neytiri, Jake is doing the seeing, Neytiri is being seen. Now if I swap the word order here, if I say Neytiri sees Jake, suddenly the relationship between the two has completely swapped. Now Neytiri is doing the seeing and Jake is being seen. And if I swap the word order even more and I say Jake Neytiri sees, suddenly we have some weird kind of Yoda speak that doesn't make any sense. Because the subject and object aren't on either side of the verb, we can no longer definitively say who is seeing and who is being seen. This is why when you hear a sentence in English with a very strange word order, it immediately sounds off and it gets really confusing. Now, as you may have heard, Nafi has what is called limited free word order. Basically, word order is very flexible. In Nafi, a sentence like Neytiri Jake sees wouldn't be too far off the mark. And in fact, they would be able to make total sense out of that. But how is this? We can't tell who's doing what based off of word order. So that must mean that there's something else at work here. So let's imagine a world in English where we don't use word order to communicate information. How else could we go about doing this? Something you might not have heard of before that is actually employed by a lot of languages is called a case system. Ultimately, what this breaks down to is, instead of leaning into word order to communicate information, there are sounds added to indicate its role. In our imaginary world where word order doesn't matter in English, this might end up looking something like this. Jake subject sees Neytiri object. You hear how I explicitly say at the end of each noun, subject or object. This is now our way of answering the question, who's doing what? We can now say something like, Neytiri object, Jake subject sees. And you can still put together who's doing what, so long as you remember what a subject and an object is. Like you do. As you remember, the subject is the one doing the verb, and the direct object is the thing affected by the verb. So, in this world where we're now explicitly saying who's doing what, we no longer need to lean into word order. This is effectively what Nafi is doing. But, ever the fans of efficiency and brevity, Nafi doesn't like saying subject and object after every single noun. Those are really long and unwieldy and it's 2 whole syllables. 2! It's outrageous. So instead they've shortened them to a single sound that they append to the end of the noun. This is how Nafi answers the question of who's doing what. The subject, or the one doing the verb, takes the L ending. This takes 2 forms, either L or il, depending on whether the word ends in a consonant or a vowel sound. This is done to maintain flow, as well as to not violate phonology rules of the language, which is fancy linguistics terms for words aren't allowed to be spelled like this. For example, in English, a word that is spelled TJSRLKQ, that's nonsense. You can't do that, right? Like, how do you even pronounce this monster? As for the direct object, this is done with the T ending. This one has more forms than the L ending. To start off with the most simple, TI will always work. You can append this to the end of a word, regardless of if it ends in a vowel or a consonant. However, there are certain situations where you can use an even shorter form of the T ending. either IT or just T by itself. The IT and T ending are employed in very similar situations. They are used when the next word either begins with a vowel or the word they are attached to is at the end of a sentence. Again, this is done for optimal flow. The IT ending is used when the word ends in a consonant, where the T ending is used when it ends in a vowel. This is important because adding a lone T after a consonant in Natfi never produces a legal sound cluster. This just goes back to the phonology of the language that I mentioned earlier. These are called case endings. They're sound endings that are put at the end of a word to indicate their case. Simple enough. So, we have the L ending for the subject and the T ending for the direct object. Now we can go back to our sentence of Jake sees Neytiri and figure out who's doing what. So let's get this sees word out of the way and replace it with tse'a, which is the Natfi word for see. Now we have Jekil tse'a Neytiriti, or Jekil tse'a Neytirit. Because as you see, Neytiri is the last word in the sentence and ends in a vowel, so we can use just the lone T ending. So we have Jekil Neytiriti tse'a, or tse'a Neytiriti Jekil, or any of the other possible permutations. Because again, these L and T endings are now indicating who's doing what. So we don't have to go through the work of putting them in a particular order. So with these three words, we end up with 6 different word orders. Which one do you pick? The answer ultimately comes down to preference. However, there's a couple of things that you might want to keep in mind to sort of get yourself speaking more like a native. For one, the generally preferred word order is subject, object, verb, or SOV order. For example, Jekil Neytiriti tse'a. However, this is just a slight preference. It is by no means a majority. Secondly, there seems to be a slight preference in Natfi towards grouping the object and subject next to each other. Usually in subject-object form, however, again, this is not required. This is to say that object-verb-subject and subject-verb-object forms tend to be a little bit more rare. However, they are not unheard of, and you should not discount the value of practicing them. Which gets me to how to practice this information most effectively. Something I see a lot of new learners doing when they're practicing case endings for the first time is they tend to lean into English word order because it's more comfortable to them. While I understand the impulse to keep things simple, this will in the long run cause you a lot of problems. You don't want to get used to any one particular word order when it comes to learning Natfi. There isn't some unspoken rule among Natfi speakers to keep things easy for the English speakers by keeping things in subject-verb-object order. We are all free to use whatever order we choose. So you want to not get too comfortable with any one particular order. Practice a variety of orders. This does require you to think about language in a slightly different way than you might be used to, though. Consider the way that you're used to listening and speaking English. You're used to things always coming in a particular order, so you're used to answering the question of who does what in a particular order. You're always used to the subject, then the verb, then the object. But when speaking Natfi, you're going to want to approach this a little bit differently. You're always going to be answering the question, who's doing what? But the order in which the information is provided to you is not always going to be the same way. So when I'm listening to and speaking Natfi, I have an internal checklist that I keep track of. I want to know what's the verb, what's the subject, and what's the direct object, if applicable. There are other roles in the sentence that we're going to get to in future lessons, but for now we're going to keep it limited to these 3 pieces of information. This checklist is going to represent my internal thought process when I'm listening to Natfi as I say these examples. Wel yom payawangti. Payawangti wel yom. Wel payawangti yom. Yom wel payawangti. Payawangti yom wel. Do you see how, as information was revealed with case endings, I was adding them to the appropriate slots? This is how you're going to want to start thinking about Natfi and sentences in the language. This idea of free word order is sort of baked into every tenet of the language. Every piece of the grammar is in service to facilitating as free of a word order as possible while still communicating information. At the end of the day, the idea of a language is to communicate information in some way, shape, or form. Every language has different rules for the way they go about doing this, but ultimately the goal is the same. We're always just answering the question of who's doing what. This question just happens to be a little bit more important in not-V because it's something you're always considering rather than something you're expecting the word order to solve for you. So everything we've covered up until now relates to what are called transitive verbs. It's a fancy linguistics term for a verb that can have a direct object. But there are many other verbs that don't take a direct object. These are called intransitive verbs. And as you would expect, they don't have a direct object. They can't, in fact, have a direct object. So an example of a transitive word would be eat. I eat fish. What do I eat? I eat fish. An example of an intransitive verb might be sleep. I sleep. I don't sleep fish, or I don't sleep other objects. Doesn't make sense. Intransitive verbs tend to be actions you can perform by yourself without interacting with anything else. Oftentimes these are actions like walking or jumping or sleeping, but there's many other intransitive verbs, some of which you might not have even thought of as intransitive before. When you look up a verb in a dictionary, it's going to have one of three types. VTR for verb transitive, VIN for verb intransitive, or the dreaded V for we really don't know and Frommer hasn't clarified yet. So, when you run into a verb that's VIN, verb intransitive, you don't want to include a direct object, because there can't be. Speaking of not having a direct object, let me pose a question. In a world where there can't be a direct object, would we ever confuse a subject for it? The answer is we couldn't, because there can't be a direct object. When using an intransitive verb, for example, hahao, to sleep, you would never say well hahao, because you don't need to add the L ending, because you don't need to clarify that oe, I, am the subject. The whole reason we were using case endings in the first place was to clarify ambiguity, to make sure that we understood who is doing what. When you have an intransitive verb, there can never be a direct object, so you never need to worry about clarifying the subject either. This may seem like it's not saving a whole lot, but not-V loves them shortcuts. They can't get enough of them. And this is true in many languages, even English. Do not, over time, just kind of became don't. It's easier to say one syllable instead of two. In future lessons, I'm going to talk about other noun cases, other than the subject and direct object. And these cases will still need case endings, even in intransitive verbs. But because a subject is a universal component of a verb statement, the subject case ending is the one that was chosen to be dropped if not important. Another thing about transitive versus intransitive verbs, every transitive verb can be used as an intransitive verb. So for example with I eat, I don't need to necessarily specify what I'm eating. I can just, in general, be eating. If you take a transitive verb and omit the object information, you can also omit the subject case ending. You can do this because not-V assumes an unmarked noun is the subject of an intransitive verb. If you hear an unmarked noun, then it's probably an intransitive subject. Or the speaker made a mistake. That's all for today's lesson. I've given us a lot to think about, so I'm going to break it down into the most important pieces. First of all, not-V has flexible word order. This means that words can go in virtually any order you choose, with some exceptions that we'll get into later. This is different from English, where words always have a set order based off of who's doing what. To answer the question of who's doing what, not-V uses case endings, which are little sounds that are added to the end of the word. The L endings are used to mark the subject, versus the T endings are used to indicate the direct object. A verb can be either transitive or intransitive. Transitive verbs can have a direct object, where intransitive verbs cannot. All transitive verbs can be used intransitively. And finally, when you're using an intransitive verb, the subject doesn't need to be marked, because it can't possibly be confused with a direct object that can't exist. I hope this video has helped you understand not-V a little bit better. Again, the foundation of not-V grammar is based off of this idea of free word order, and answering the question of who is doing what. Every piece of the grammar is in service to this idea, and you'll see this in future lessons. Hej allevaj!